I'm going to be covering the group project and group project prototype in this video. And so before I jump into the code, let's actually take a look now at the database that I've given you. Now this isn't a database class and I don't expect you to have much database background. So I've given you this Access database with just a few tables in it. So this first one is the invoices table. And you can see we've got an invoice number, invoice date, and total cost. And so the idea behind this table is where we're going to save that top level record for each invoice that we're going to be saving for our small business. So this invoice number is an auto-generated number, so it's generated by the actual database itself, where the invoice date is going to be selected by the user. Total cost is the total cost of all the items. So if we come over here, the item description table has an item code, which is the primary key for each of these items. Then we have an item description and a cost. So these are all the items that a person coming into our store could buy. This line items table links up the the tables we just talked about. So we've got the invoice number, and then here's the line item number. So this is just incremented 1, 2, 3, 4, and then here's the item codes for this invoice. So for what it's saying is for invoice 5,000, it has items A, B, C, and D on it. So that's how this database is set up. Now also I've given you this Word document for database help. Inside of it you'll find the connection strings, you'll find a description of each of the tables, and the most important part is you'll notice that I have the SQL for the items window, the main window, and the search window. So later on when I reference the SQL that I've already given you, this is what I'm talking about. Now the one thing that I have seen a mistake from students is that I've just hard-coded values in here. So for instance, if you're trying to select this distinct invoice number from line items where item code equals A, so I've hard-coded A right here to show you that this is something you would have to pass in. Same thing here. If you're inserting in new items into the database, you would have to put in your own code, your own description, and your own cost. So just remember that when it comes to this SQL file. Let's go ahead and jump into the code now. So first I want to talk about the prototype. So the purpose of the prototype is just to bring the team together, get you communicating, outline the project, talk about who's going to do which windows, and really discuss the interface for how you're going to communicate between the windows. So the basic requirements for the prototype are to create 3 folders: the items, the main, and the search window folders. This is really easy. You just right click and say add a new folder, and then you name it, and then from there you can start adding items. Now again, I'm going to just do the very basics for you, but this is stuff you should be able to do in 10-15 minutes. And so per the requirements, I expect you to have 3 different files for the items, the main, and the search. So let's just go through one of them. So for the items, I've said I wanted you to have an items logic class. For the main, I've said a main logic class, and the search, a search logic class. So this is where all the business logic is going to go for your code, based on which window you have to do. Now each SQL class, the items or the main or the search, hold just SQL statements. So they're going to have methods that just return the strings for the SQL statements that we just looked at. So no code will be executed in these SQL files here. It'll just return strings. Those SQL statements will actually be executed in this item logic class. And that way all of your SQL is kind of in one place where it's really easy to find and update if you have to. Then each one has the window, the XAML window for the items, the main, or the search. So this is how it should be broken out. Now I would recommend maybe one person in the team sort of create this outline and then send it out to everyone else so you can just sort of start your project from there. I find that if you just do your individual parts and then you try to put them all into a project later, it just creates some headaches because you'll have like your namespaces off in between if you do different projects and you name things different, and it's an absolute nightmare. So I just recommend one person do this. So then there's only a handful of other requirements for the prototype. Again, make sure you put all the SQL statements in here. And then behind each of the UI, you want to comment how these windows are going to interface with each other. So for example, the items window, the user has the ability to add a new item, delete an item, or update an item. So whenever that happens, you want to set something in this window here that when it closes, the main window can check it and say, hey, has any of these items been updated? Yes, therefore update a little combo box on the main window. In the search window, when it gets opened, the user is going to select an invoice, and somehow that invoice ID needs to be returned to the main window. So we'll have to create some sort of property in the search window that the main window can check to see if an invoice was actually selected, and therefore we can now load that invoice into the main window. So again, we'll have to comment some of things like that for the prototype. Now let's just go ahead and go through these windows and let's just kind of walk through the code. Again, I'm not going to go through all of the requirements. This is pretty high level, just sort of how I would think through solving this problem. Now again, remember the difference between the prototype and the final project, where the prototype doesn't have to have any code executable other than the project has to run. I need to be able to open the windows and navigate between them. The UIs need to be completed, things like that. Now for the full project, let's go ahead and just start with items. Now what I've done here is I've just dragged and dropped some UI elements. I tried to make it so I wouldn't influence you on how it should look. Again, the UI, I'm just dragged some items on here so we visually could see, okay, what kind of things are we going to have to worry about for our items. So what's the first thing? Well, we can see right here, we knew from the requirements that we've got a code, a cost, and description. We're going to have some sort of data grid where all of the items are displayed. We need to add an item, edit an item, and delete an item. So those are all the requirements. Now, behind the UI, I'm not going to stub out all of the different methods for adding an item, editing an item, deleting an item, but try to think through visually what we're going to have to do here. So when we add an item, we're going to have like some text boxes up here that the user can enter this information. If you're editing an item, then you're going to have to be able to click here, which means if I select the second row here, the second item, I need to populate that over here, so when you click edit, you can then change the data and then save it. So we'll probably also need a save item button. And then delete here, so let's go ahead and add that just so we don't forget that. Just say save item. I guess that's technically the edit item, but the edit item should just enable this, and then the save item would be to save it. Or if you're adding item, save item. So the save item probably has multiple uses within it. And then delete item, don't forget that there's a requirement that when we delete the item, we need to check to see if that invoice is on any, if that item is on any invoices, and if it is, we need to alert the user to that. Because we can't delete an item that's on an invoice. So that would kind of corrupt our database model. So let's think through the user interface here. Again, I'm not going to go through all the different methods. I just kind of want to go through the basics. Now remember, if we come in here and the user's added an item, edited an item, or deleted an item, we need ability to let the user interface know. So what I would recommend you do is create some sort of property like this. So I'm going to create an attribute, B has items changed, and then a public property that the main UI can look at and say, hey, has any of these items changed, yes or no? Therefore, I can update my list of items on the main window. So again, you'll want to actually create some methods, again, that we did up here. Then you'll also want to add these in and then add some comments about how you're going to use this. And so that way, I know that you're thinking through this problem about how the items window is going to interface with the main window. Now you'll notice the items window doesn't know anything about the outside world. It just knows about itself. So the main window needs to look into this window using this property to know if anything has changed. So from there, we've got our items SQL class. Now this, all we're going to do is create methods based on that Word document that I give you. So just create all the SQL statements, and now they'll just return those strings. And that's all you have to do there. So now let's start thinking through the items logic and what sort of things are going to go in here. So again, let's look at our main UI. So if we come here, okay, well, we know we're going to have to fill up this data grid here. So we know that we're going to have to fill up some sort of list of items. Oh, well, there you go. There's an idea. We need a items class. So what I've actually done is, because I've already kind of thought through this, is I've actually created this common folder up here. Now the reason I did this is because if you really think through the problem completely, again, I know I've done this ahead of time, but there's two things. There's an item and an invoice class that will be used throughout this application. So that's why I put this common folder here, so that these are common classes that are going to be used throughout the program. So the item would just have, so let's go over here and let's create our item class. And so our item class, based on that database we just looked at, is going to have code, description, and cost inside of it. So that's all our item class does. And then from there, in our items logic now, we can say, okay, I want to create a method that's going to get all of my items and return that as a list of items. So I'm just going to stub this out. I'm going to say to myself, I need to create a method called getAllItems, which returns a list of items. Again, that's to fill up this here. And then of course you'd have to have some UI item here that, on the constructor of this window goes out and fills all these up, things like that, or refreshes it, based on how the items are updated here. So the next thing we have to think about is, okay, what's the next functionality? So we come over here and we notice we have add, edit, and delete. So those are kind of the next things we're going to have to do. So we're going to add an item. Now you'll notice I'm also telling myself, hey, I'm probably also expecting this to be passed in an item object. And that way, if someone, that contains all of the information that I'll need to actually insert in this in the database. And again, this way, I don't have to know anything about the window. You pass in all the information and this method will take care of it. Now we need to do something similar for editing items. And so if I come in here, if I edit an item, I'll have to actually have my old item and the new item. So when the user comes in here, now as far as the old item, I probably also could have just passed in like the item code or something like that, but there's different ways you can do this. And so I pass in the old item, I pass in the new item, and now I know how to edit that in the database. And I've got the SQL for that and things that I can call. So the next we're going to have to do is we're going to have to delete the item. And so we just say we're going to create a method called delete item, and then we're going to have to pass in that item to delete. So there's one other step now, remember, that if I'm deleting an item, what do I have to do? I also have to make sure that that item is not already on an invoice. So I'm going to have to create some other method that just says, is item on invoice? Here's this item. And so that way I'm checking, and then this can return maybe a list of all the items that are on that given invoice. Something to that nature. Okay, so now we've moved the items. Let's go ahead and take a look at the main window. So now I've put together some main window here. So on the main window, there's a requirement to have a menu appear for search and edit items. And this just opens the other windows. We also need to be able to edit an invoice and save an invoice. So after the user has selected an invoice from the search window, we need to load it here, and then it's in read-only mode. And from read-only mode, we can edit it, and then edit the invoice, then resave it, or we can just create a new invoice and save the invoice here. So we probably might also need like a create invoice button up here that we initially press, or you just kind of default into the create invoice. There's different ways you can do it. I've also kind of just stubbed out the different things from reading the requirements. So we're going to have an invoice date that the user selects. Invoice number, this is actually TBD until the user saves it, and then we get it from the database and we fill it in. Total cost is as the user selects items here, so this is a list of all the items, I add the item here. This will be a list of all the items I want on the invoice, or I can remove an item. And as I'm doing that, I'm updating the total cost here. So when I select an item here, the cost gets displayed. I continue to this and then eventually save the invoice once all the items are on it. Now again, please don't think the UI needs to look anything like this. I expect you to redesign it, and kind of work through the flow and whatever makes sense for you there. So same thing, main SQL. Again, this is going to be another class. You just copy and paste all of the SQL files there. And then the main logic is where all the business logic is going to go. Now behind the main UI, I've thought through a few things here that we already talked about. So I just put some comments in here that, after the search window is closed, we're going to check the property sSelected invoice ID. Now I've kind of jumped ahead here. Again, I've thought through how an invoice is going to be selected and how we're going to select that invoice ID, return it here. Here on the items window, we're going to check that property B has item changed. So if we come back over here, you can notice I'm just referencing this B has items changed is all I'm doing there. Again, we'll get to this search invoice ID in just a minute. But this is part of the requirements for the prototype where you're going to have to then stub in some code here and explain how you're going to handle both of these items for the main window. So now if we come back to the main window, just get rid of some of these windows here, easier to work with. So let's talk about the main window logic now. So in the main window logic, there's a couple things we're going to have to do. And again, I've kind of already thought through these. Is we're going to have to save an invoice, edit an invoice. We're going to have to get all of the items here. Again, this is all the items to display. Now, the add and remove item, this is just all in memory, the data that gets shown here. Only when we've searched for an invoice would we actually have to get this from the database. Other than that, this is updating and editing all in memory. Again, but if we're searching for an invoice, then we'd have to get all of the items on the given invoice. So there's a few different things we have to think through when we're creating a new invoice and when we're editing an existing invoice. So the logic, one, we're going to have some kind of method that gets all of the items and returns them in a list. So that's what we're going to have to do here. So this is the idea that, again, we've searched for an invoice, we've selected it, and we've come back, and now we need to display all the items that are on that invoice to the user. Save a new invoice, edit an existing invoice, and then get the invoice. So if we search for an invoice, that's where we're doing this here. So again, there's different methods that I've started to think through. Sorry, this is the combo box. Get all the items in the combo box here. So we have to fill up there. Now you'll also kind of think through this is that get all the items there. This method and the get all the items from up here, maybe you need to create a common class where this method actually contains in both of them. It is used by both the items and the main, because there's different places that you're going to have to do the exact same thing. So just kind of think of that. But this is kind of the idea behind the main logic. Now the search window, let's go ahead and move over to that. In the search window, I've kind of laid it out where when this window first opens, we're going to have to display all of the invoices here. So what that tells me is that I'm going to have some sort of invoice. Now in our invoice, it's going to have a few different attributes based on what was in that database. And so the way I looked at it was the invoice number, the invoice date, the total cost, and a list of all the items that would be on that invoice. So if we come back to the search now, in the search we've got the item number, the invoice number, invoice date, and total costs. And what we'd want to do here is put some combo boxes that the user can select and filter what we got down here. So we're going to need to be able to filter and select unique invoice numbers, invoice dates, and total costs. Then as the user selects these, we have to filter that data, and then we have to let the user select the invoice. So let's just think through select invoice now. So when the user selects the invoice, we need to set a local variable that holds the invoice ID for the selected invoice, and that way the main window can access that via a property, and it knows whether or not an invoice has been selected or the user just closed this window. So over here on my search window, what I would do is, again, just kind of stub out some code that you're thinking about how you're going to pass around the data. So something like this, where we've got this variable selected invoice ID and the property, so they get filled up. The main window can access this. Again, the search window should know nothing about the main window. It should be self-contained, where the main window can look into it via this property and be able to figure out if invoice was selected. So next, what we're going to have to do now is we have to think to ourselves, okay, how do we filter this data based on this data up here? And that's kind of where we're going to have to go into this search logic now. So first, jump back here. We're going to have to fill up these different combo boxes here. So we're going to need to get some methods. Get rid of this. Sorry, I kind of closed down a few things. In our search logic, we're going to want to get, get distinct, and then we want invoice numbers. Then we'd also want to get distinct invoice dates and invoice costs. And so this is going to return us probably just a list of strings that we can then load into these combo boxes. Next, what we have to have is, okay, the user has selected these, and then when they click, and then as they select these, maybe either a filter, or we can just filter on the selected index change. But we know that the user possibly has selected the invoice number, the invoice date, and total cost. Now there's various ways that we can choose to filter this data, but just thinking at the top level, I would just rather, right from the beginning, pass in the invoice number, the invoice date, and total cost. And if the user hasn't selected one, I'll just pass in null. That's kind of the way I was thinking through this. And so the top level method over here on our search logic, is get invoices. And you can see I've thought to myself, okay, pass in the invoice number, the invoice date, and total cost. And then that's going to return this list that's then bound to the user interface. Now within this, I would write some sub methods or something like that that then calls the appropriate SQL statements or builds the appropriate SQL statement based on which of these are actually passed in. But as far as the main window goes, maybe it's just one method that it calls, and then all the complexity happens in private methods in this class. So that's kind of the basics of the group project. Again, I have not done all of the requirements. There's a few things like you need to make sure you theme the entire application. Everything needs try-catch blocks. Another thing that I would really recommend doing is unit testing other members' code. So let's say you have the main window. That means that a week before the group project's due, you want everyone to bring their code together. And then it's your job to go back and unit test all of the items code and all of the search code, just like the other individuals in your group would need to unit test your code. And so it's their job also to go in and take a look at every one of your methods and run them and make sure they work as advertised. Same thing with the items here in your main. So it's their job to go through and try to break your code, right? On the items window, for example. What happens if they don't enter any data and they click save item? Well, if you try to save a bunch of nulls to the database, it's going to throw an exception. And so they also need to check, hey, do you have all the proper exception handling, and have you met all of the requirements that are in that document? So please try to communicate within your groups and let me know if you have any questions.